Hello again, Claude Warship 42 here with another story. Today, our story entraps the mind of James. James the Red Engine, the vain and conceited but also friendly Red Engine that he is. And he is in for one of the worst nightmares of his life. James was puffing down the tracks with a train of coal trucks. They were old and rusty and shook and rattled with each wheel turn, causing coal dust to fly out all over James. "You nasty things," he complained. "Look at what you're doing to my splendid red paint." The trucks all coughed, they wheezed, and then laughed. "It's not our fault, Red Scrap Iron," said a truck. "Get your fat bugger to fix us," said another truck. "We've been dying here," said a third truck. All of them cackled with laughter. James rolled his eyes. Still, the truck on their own way were right in the situation. They deserved to be fixed like the other engines. The rust had affected their axles and brakes and James climbed Gordon's Hill. At the summit, James was now puffing down at speed. The trucks' brakes failed and their weight began pushing James down the hill faster and faster. "Whoa! Slow down! Brakes! Brakes! Brakes!" he yelled. We're trying! The truck screamed. Ahead was a sharp turn. James hit the turn at full speed and tumbled off the line. He rolled around in a muddy field before coming to a stop. His trucks all ran into each other and plowed into the back of his tender, crushing and crumpling it. James would now lay in a field of hurt. His trucks were all battered and broken. The coal spilled out all over the place. His driver and fireman jumped clear and ran to the nearest signal box to call for help. Edward arrived a half an hour later with the breakdown train to hoist James back onto the track. His tender was absolutely thrashed and broken. James was being hoisted onto a flatbed and secured to it. "Are you all right, James?" asked Edward. "I'll be fine, as soon as I get to the steamworks," said James. "Hang in there, old boy," replied Edward. At the steamworks, the Fat Controller met James. "It was the trucks, sir. They need to be fixed. They were rusty and their brakes failed." "I understand, James. However, you'll be fixed by tomorrow morning. I still need your help with the new station in Brendam." "What about my tender, sir?" asked James. "Henry collected a temporary replacement one from the scrapyard. We have no other choice," said the Fat Controller. "I understand," muttered James. "Now rest up. It's going to be busy tomorrow." The following morning, James puffed out of the steamworks with his temporary tender trailing behind him. It was black in color and a bit grimy, but appeared to be in working order and good shape. James coupled up to a line of branch coaches, his first job for the day. Thomas met him at the station. "How are you feeling today, James?" "Better?" said Thomas. James sneered and then snapped at Thomas. "Bugger off, you pathetic little hunk of scrap, you!" said James. Thomas was shocked. But before he could answer, James puffed away with his coaches. James rode very roughly on the branch line with his coaches. His driver and fireman were getting bucked and bumped all over the cab. "Easy, old boy. We're not pulling freight," said his driver. James growled and snapped back. "Shut your fucking mouths! Shut the fuck up, you silly sods!" Everyone, including the passengers, were shocked. James was acting like a totally different engine. Later at night, Thomas was telling the other engines what James had said. The engines were speechless. Even Gordon couldn't believe it. James angrily puffed onto the turntable a little while later, and Henry chimed to him. "How was your run, old boy? You feel good?" James snarled and said, "Wouldn't you like to fucking know, you fat green whale? Stink this lot full of fish, you do. Do yourself a favor, have a wash and go melt down in the scrapyard." The engines were appalled. They couldn't believe what James was saying. Gordon spoke up first. "Don't you dare speak to Henry like that." Gordon confronted. "Where are your friends, James? What's your problem?" James just sneered again and growled, "You fat, galloping sausage, mind your own fucking business, and let an important engine get some sleep." James backed down into his berth and disappeared into the dark. The other engines didn't know what to say. James was usually a vain and conceited engine, but he was also kind and caring. But this was a totally different personality from his usual self. In the middle of the night, all the engines were asleep, but they were awoken by a rattling and a wheezing sound. "What's all that noise?" said Percy. They heard a voice coming from the middle of the shed. It was James. He was shaking all over and talking to himself. "No! No! Get away! Stay away from me! Get out of me!" He cried out in agony. James, what's going on?" said Thomas. Gordon was frozen in confusion. Henry and the others all looked at the red engine in absolute shock and confusion. Suddenly, a loud, blood-curdling scream echoed from James's mouth. "Oh!" He screamed, his eyes rolled back into his smoke box. The engines were all shocked by his expression and began freaking out, trying to calm him down, trying to process what was going on. Suddenly, James' face disappeared, and an evil, foreign grimace of another engine appeared on it. "I am in control now," the face said. The engines were all horrified. James's face suddenly came back and kept letting out its ghostly wail before it suddenly went silent. James's face was back, and he was fast asleep. The other engines were frightened and shaking in their buffers. It's safe to say they didn't get any more sleep that night, and instead talked about what they should do. The next morning, James was steaming and left early. He was ordered to take the Fat Controller's private coach to the news station at Brendam for its grand opening. James did he was told, still he grumbled at the station. The coaches in its royal maroon color were shining and their glass reflected the sun brightly. James was acting impatient. The Fat Controller stepped out on the platform in a brand new suit and top hat and entered his coach. Scoffed James. "Look at Lord Fat Fuck. Finally we could get going now." James left the station with a jerk and a roar, making the Fat Controller almost fall over in his coach. Presently, James did need to stop for water, which they did. Meanwhile, the other engines were discussing what was wrong with James. "I've never heard him talk like that," said Gordon. "I've never seen him so angry," chimed Henry. "It was frightening. What happened last night? I've never seen something so disturbing," said Thomas. Percy meekly asked, "What if it's his tender?" Everyone thought for a moment. "He wasn't like that when I rescued him from his accident," said Edward. "He started saying those things after he got that replacement tender." They all pondered. "You found that tender, Henry. Who did it belong to?" asked Edward. "I don't know. It was alone on a siding by itself in the scrapyard. It was in rough shape, but it worked all right." "I think there's something supernatural going on," muttered Thomas. "Don't be daft, Thomas," said Henry. "Daft, Henry? How else do you explain what we saw last night?" Henry thought for a moment. "Fair enough," he said. "The only way to get to the bottom of this is if we go to the scrapyard and ask around about the tender. They should know something." "Well, I've got work to do just like everybody else here," said Gordon. "Well, I got a clear schedule," said Edward. "I'll go alone. You all do what you have to do today." The engines all agreed. They went off to do their jobs while Edward chuffed as quickly as he could to the scrapyard. Edward puffed into the scrapyard and was immediately met by Harry and Bert. "Oi! What are you doing here? There's no trains leaving today. Unless you're here to scrap yourself," said Harry. "Stow it, Harry," snapped Bert. "What can we do for you?" "You had a tender here, a black one. We took it as a temporary one for James. Who did it belong to?" "We have a lot of old tenders here," said Harry. "The only one we don't touch is the one in siding F. See for yourself." Harry stopped dead in his tracks. The tender from siding F was gone. "You took that tender? What'd you do with it?" asked Bert. "James has it. He got into an accident and he needed a temporary one," said Edward. Harry and Bert both looked down. "That's not good," said Bert. "Your friend is in serious danger," said Harry. "What? Tell me now." Tell me who that tender belonged to now, Edward said angrily. Bert spoke up. Listen here. The tender belonged to Alfred, or 87546. He was a arrogant blowhard and a sociopath. He committed suicide trying to blow up a station full of passengers. He was scrapped, but his tender stayed. Strange things happened when we had to move it around, so we left it alone. Your big number green 3 Henry must have made a dire mistake. Alfred's malevolent spirit must have possessed him, and he's out for revenge. I'll help in any way we can. We've got to get James away from that tender. Edward was shocked, but him and Bert made their way across the island. Where is James now? As Edward met Thomas at the branch line station. He's taking the Fat Controller to the grand opening of Brendan Bay Station, said Thomas. We've got to stop him. Gather the others. And Edward quickly thought up a plan to slow the train down. James was barreling down the main line at a great rate of speed. The Fat Controller was getting knocked about his coach. The driver and fireman tried desperately to slow James down, but it was no use. Further down the line, Edward, Gordon, and Henry barricaded the line with trucks. As James drew near, he slowed down to a stop, now confronted with Edward, Henry, and Gordon in front. Thomas, Bert, and Percy taking up the back to make sure he couldn't go backwards. As James stopped, his body started to shake again, and his mouth opened and began to scream. His driver and fireman hopped down from the cab, as well as the Fat Controller, who ran around to see what was going on. James began wailing as his eyes rolled back into his smokebox, and the face of Alfred appeared on his smokebox. The Fat Controller was at a loss for words, recognizing the face on James. Hello, Fat Hat! I was this close to getting my blood lost for you, said Alfred. Bring James back, he demanded to the demon. That whiny little nuisance doesn't even know I'm using him as a vessel. Once I'm in this body long enough, he'll be gone, and here I will stay, and I will finally get my revenge on you! Give us James back, the engines all said. You'll have to catch me first, and Alfred backed up, smashing the coaches into Percy's buffers. Ouch, said Percy. Even with his brakes on, he couldn't hold back the malevolent Alfred as sparks flew from his wheels. Percy tried as hard as he could, but he was knocked off the track. What are we going to do now? Said Edward. Harry and Bert just smiled. We called for some backup. Alfred was flying in reverse down the track and suddenly heard a loud, low horn. Toot toot! Alfred felt a large force push up against him from behind, and a squeaking howl from a hydraulic machine moving. What is this? Said Alfred. Edward and Thomas coupled up to the front of Alfred and began holding him back so he couldn't move anymore. Now! Shouted Edward, as a large claw came crunching down onto the haunted tender. No! Screamed Alfred. Diesel 10 had come to the rescue and was now had his claw crunching up around the tender. Tear it up now, said Edward. With pleasure, he said as he ripped the tender away from James's cab. James's face began to appear on his smokebox again, along with Alfred's own face melting away. Alfred's face screamed as he vanished from James's face, and as the old tender was ripped away from James's cab and crushed into scrap iron by Diesel 10's claw. Diesel 10 now destroyed the tender, and James was finally separated by the vile entity of Alfred. The Fat Controller commanded, Get him to the works immediately! Gordon coupled up to James and quickly rushed him to the steamworks. The other engines gathered outside the steamworks as the mechanics began working on him. The engines all stayed at the steamworks overnight, and when morning broke, a familiar whistle rang out and James puffed out of the steamworks. He was frightened, but he smiled a little bit. All the engines whistled back at their friend, finally back to normal again. You were all waiting for me to wake up? Of course, James, said Edward. We're your friends. We care about you. Wouldn't be the same team without you, little James, said Gordon. Yeah, who am I going to be cheeky to, said Thomas. Everyone was worried about you, James, and we are pleased to finally have the real you back, said the Fat Controller. James was taken aback. He felt good. I honestly don't know what to say. I'm just glad that the nightmare is over. All the engines agreed. It's good to have my old tender back, said James. Well, your job's not done yet, said the Fat Controller. You still have a special train to pull, taking me to the grand opening of Brendan Bay Station. And James just smiled and said, right away, sir, beep, beep. And that is the end of the story. Or is it?